Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was a genius and was born with a red hair. Naruto was born with hair as red as his mother's, but with a face and intellect that paralleled his father, the Fourth Hokage. Will the revolution he brings be the world's salvation or destruction? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 17, A Will Inherited. The last time Naruto had a private audience with the Hokage, he had been 6 years old. The Hokage's office had seemed immense to him then, and the Hokage himself had been an alien, untouchable figure. But as he stood before the desk once more, the room, though big, was contained, and the man had never looked as weary as he did now. "So you know the truth now," said the Hokage quietly, getting straight to the point. He was seated behind his desk, the white hat that signified his status cast shadows over his lined face. "Yes," Naruto said simply, remaining stiffly in his standing position. "Kakashi has filled me in on what he's told you, including the fact that he has suppressed the taboo seal. But there are still certain things that he has wisely decided not to tell you, or perhaps he has forgotten them himself." With his wrinkled fingers steepled against each other on the desk, the Hokage looked straight at Naruto. "For the village, I sacrificed your childhood. You must despise me." "I don't know how I feel," said Naruto, slightly taken aback by the man's directness despite himself. "All I know is that the fourth Hokage was the one who sealed the 9 tails within me. And that for this, all the villagers hate me. Kakashi-sensei told me that there was an accident when I was 6, but I recall that I was unwanted even before then. Even I do not still quite understand what happened the night the 9 tails attacked Konoha," said the Hokage heavily. "But Naruto, did you know that Konoha has controlled the 9 tails for several generations now? You are not our first Jinchuriki. We had 2 before you, and they were both Uzumakis as well." Naruto's eyes widened by a margin. "Yes, your mother, Uzumaki Kushina, was the Jinchuriki before you." Naruto paused. "My mother. And the one single thing that most weakens a Jinchuriki's seal, that is, a Jinchuriki's most vulnerable, natural state, is when she is giving birth." The Hokage nodded at Naruto's surprised expression. "Yes, your mother risked quite a lot when she became pregnant with you. I thought Minato would be able to suppress it, but somehow it escaped. I suspect there was a third party, but we've never found any leads in that investigation. Regardless, in the aftermath, Minato and Kushina both sacrificed their lives to seal it once more within you." His face darkened. "Unfortunately, the majority of the village was not aware that Kushina was pregnant. For her and your safety, Minato and Kushina kept her pregnancy a secret. And so, to this day, they still do not understand how it escaped. I believe some people who were not familiar with Kushina may have actually believed that she had released the 9 tails itself." "What?" Naruto cut in, his brow furrowed in thought. "Why did you keep it a secret after they died then? Why not tell everyone that I was their son, and that it wasn't her fault? I may be Hokage, but even I do not have the power to control people's hearts," said the Hokage heavily. "Fear and prejudice are powerful forces. Following Minato's wishes, the surname Namikaze was widely feared across the nations, and may have instigated assassination attempts against you. You were given your mother's name, Uzumaki. With you being a newly born red-haired infant and having the last name Uzumaki, I'm sure anyone could have connected the dots. But inevitably, rumors were spread. You would not be able to tell given Konoha's present prosperity, but back then, it was a time of great loss and uncertainty. Many people had died, and the great Fourth Hokage had even given his life to defeat the beast. It is unfortunate, but people who are grieving do not always look to reason, and you became an outlet for their pain. It didn't help that even some of the shinobi themselves held preconceived notions about Jinchuriki, helping to set off what would soon become a village-wide movement against you, Naruto." The Hokage paused. "You may not have been aware of it, but I always had at least 2 of my Umbu keep watch over you during your childhood. It was rare, but there were times they had to step in to prevent any bodily harm from happening to you." "I remember," Naruto said quietly, thinking back to the time when the Umbu had scooped him up from inside his apartment. "And yet, why didn't I step in?" The Hokage mused out loud, as if reading Naruto's mind. Why didn't I act as a grandfatherly figure towards you? Why did I seal your memories? Naruto nodded mutely. When you were just an infant, I put you in the care of an retiree, your caretaker. I had resumed my duties as the village's Hokage and there were many, many things to take care of. I was incredibly busy, but regardless, I checked on you every now and then. You must not remember me, but it was I who bought you your first book, a book of folk tales. And Kakashi was there as well, he carved you a set of wooden blocks. This may very well have continued in this pattern, if another incident hadn't happened. Right before you turned 6, an anonymous organization somehow received intel on you, and sent a squad to infiltrate the village and kidnap you. You were able to release some of the Nine Tails' power, and you slaughtered them, but you lost control, and in the process, killed several ninja who were at the scene as well, including your caretaker. His mouth turned dry as he rewound his memories back to the morning he had woken up on his 6th birthday to a cold, empty room. There was an immediate backlash. Civilians and ninja alike believed this only confirmed their worst fear, that the Nine Tails was taking over your conscious and would eventually be released once more. The most radical of them wanted you to be put down, but they had to be appeased with the application of a taboo seal, which effects I believe Kakashi informed you on. The Hokage's eyes swept over Naruto's tersely set jaw and whitened knuckles, and gave a slight nod. Your feelings of anger are to be expected. Even at such a young age, you had set yourself apart as a gifted child much like your father once was. And it is clear now, from the level of self-mastery you displayed during the Chunin exams, that if we had informed you of your situation and taught you to control the Nine Tails, you would have succeeded. Yet, we treated you as an ignorant child, no, as an animal, pushing you back and forth at our slightest whims. I cannot foresee the future. I had personally inspected Minato's seal, but there were certain elements that had never been used in a Jinchuriki seal before. Knowing Minato as I did, I knew he would not have made a mistake, but there was always a feeling of unease whenever I saw you. Your red hair was a trademark of the Uzumaki clan and your whisker-like birthmarks were a result of your receiving your mother's influence while in her womb, but at the same time, you seemed like the very image of a Nine Tails that had been reborn incarnate. And so, I gave in to the fears of an aging, feeble mind. I see that I have given you much to think about. That is all I have to say, unless you have further questions, but all I ask is that you not blame the tool that carries out the hand's bidding. You may hate me as you wish, but I hope that you will keep considering Konoha your home. The villagers have not treated you fairly, they have trampled and spat on you when they should have loved and raised you as one of their own. But believe me when I say that their actions were not out of malice for you. They were a result of fear and uncertainty, a lack of belief in those that had died for the village. However, from having personally looked over your growth through such difficulty, I can now say with a sincere heart that I believe you have the strength to overcome this. The Hokage stopped for a second to bore his gaze into Naruto's. You must have known this for a long time now, but I have only just realized, you are strong, stronger than I had once thought. While I had once seen the Nine Tails in your red hair, all I see in it now is the will of fire that burns within you. I see, said Naruto, carefully keeping his face blank. Then there is just one question I'd like to ask, Hokage-sama. It was the Hokage's turn to blink. Clearly, he had been expecting more of a reaction. What seal did my father use on me, and how much control do I have over it? The Hokage slowly nodded. Minato sealed half of the Nine Tails within you using the 8 trigrams seal, which is a special kind of seal that allows the vessel to access the chakra of the contained beast, and the other half, he sealed within himself using the Reaper Death seal, which is a seal that requires the caster's death. The Hokage paused. I do not believe your father intended it to be a curse, Naruto. Did you know, that at one point, Minato was considered the child of a prophecy, and fated to change the world? Jiraiya certainly thought so. However, I believe that Minato thought that it would be you, rather, who would revolutionize this world. And so, he left you this power in order to have the ability to do so. Following the talk, the taboo seal was quickly and discreetly removed. It was a brief affair. Bearing the back of his neck to the Hokage, the man made a twisting motion with an outstretched hand. There was a flash of white pain, and then there was nothing. Immediately, Naruto could feel the difference. As if a tightly contained, dense fog had suddenly been vacuumed away, the block in his mind disappeared, revealing the large tunnel he had seen earlier. For now, Naruto decided he would hold himself back from exploring it. The Hokage had warned him not to hurtle headfirst into the newly discovered sections of his memory. The influx of lost memories could confuse and overwhelm his brain and lead to possible complications. It would be better for him to let them return on their own. Over time, piece by piece, they would fall naturally back into place. As for the Nine Tails itself, Naruto hadn't yet decided how to more formally approach it. According to the Hokage's explanation, he should be able to access its chakra, but just from his brief impromptu interaction with it during the exam, he knew it wouldn't be easy. The sun was just beginning to set when Naruto finally returned to his apartment and lay face down on his bed. Contrary to the carefully composed blank mask he'd presented to the Hokage, his mind was still caught up in a whirlwind of questions and indecision. He did not know what to believe. He had accepted the Hokage's explanation as sincere, but that did not mean he had to like it. Typical of a doting father, the Hokage had tried to cover for his ignorant children's behavior, but Naruto no longer needed their approval. Speaking of fathers, it was still hard to take in that the legendary Fourth Hokage was his. And contrary to how Naruto had perceived it as a child, it had not been his father but his mother who'd been his connection to the Uzumaki clan. He had first felt betrayed that his parents had been the ones to seal the Nine Tails inside of him, but the realization that his mother had been the Jinchuriki before him took some of the sting away. The Hokage had also said that his father had hoped he would be able to harness the Nine Tails' power for the sake of the world and by extension, the village. Whether or not that was true, the Hokage had been laying it on a bit thick near the end. He didn't care about any of that, or the will of fire. Why should he have the desire to believe, cherish, and fight for the villagers when they would never do the same back for him? Naruto shifted his grudging body around and looked up at the empty ceiling. What he did want was to become strong, however, strong enough to be able to protect the people he did care about. The skies outside were dark when Naruto restlessly jumped to his feet and left the apartment. Wandering about through the marketplace which bustled with activity in the dinner rush, ignoring the looks, as always, that some of the passing villagers were giving him, he found his feet automatically moving him toward the direction of Ichiraku's, from which emanated the rich, heavy smell of ramen. Lifting the entrance flap, he saw a flash of silver as one of the sitting customers turned around to look at him. Hesitating for a brief second, Naruto made his way past a rowdy crowd and sat next to its source. "So, a miso pork ramen, large, extra garlic?" "The usual?" asked Ichiraku's owner, hanging over the counter. Despite the hubbub, he always seemed to be able to spot Naruto's telltale red hair. "Yes please." "Ah, that's what I forgot." From beside him, Kakashi leaned his masked face against his hand. "Extra garlic on mine too, Teiuchi." "Coming right up," said the man, returning his attention to the boiling metal pots before him. As they waited for their food, they sat there quietly, letting the outside conversations wash over them like white noise. And when their ramen bowls were set before them, they tucked in, making sure to slurp loud enough for the Ichiraku owner to hear. Only once both bowls were cleared and their stomachs verging on the uncomfortably full, did Naruto finally speak up. "What did you think of my final match, sensei?" said Kakashi distractedly, putting his book down. "Ah yes, that was an interesting move you did back then, Naruto. You might have gotten her, too, if you didn't slip up there at the end." "So you noticed," Naruto nodded. "I'd thought about it in theory but I hadn't actually tried it before then. It was harder than I thought it'd be. What I did was, I made my chakra. You made it dense to give it power, spun it in multiple directions to give it rotation, and then merged it together to give it stability. And, you messed up at the stability step. Am I right?" Naruto blinked, and Kakashi let out a small chuckle. "Believe it or not, you're not the first person to have thought of that, Naruto. It's called the Rasengan. I'm curious though, how did you think of it?" "That time back in Yugakure, when you used your Reikari, it helped me realize that there's more to jutsu than hand seals," said Naruto. "It gave me the idea of channeling a certain amount of chakra to a certain area of the body to enhance its function, and for someone like me with excessive chakra stores, I knew I could somehow utilize the destructive power of pure chakra. Though I see now that it's harder than I thought it'd be to keep it under control. I can teach you how to better stabilize it, said Kakashi, looking at Naruto. If you'll let me? Naruto could sense the second question that lingered unspoken in the air, but he had already made up his mind. Yes, sensei. All right then, said Kakashi with a nod. We'll get started right away. Meet me at Field B tomorrow at 7 am. Sharp. With a clatter of his chair, Kakashi got up to leave, tucking his precious book into a pouch on his side. Naruto regarded him skeptically. So you mean noon? A ninja always keeps his word, Naruto. Ichiraku's owner cleared his throat meaningfully. Is that why you are leaving me the bill? Naruto asked dryly. I only treat cute little genin. You're a chunin now, you're one of them big boys. But you know, it's interesting. Kakashi looked thoughtful. What is? He asked, despite himself. Did you know that the fourth was the one who invented the Rasengan? Through his mask, Kakashi smiled at Naruto's dumbfounded expression before disappearing in a swirl of leaves. It was a cold evening that day in Konoha. The last lights of the marketplace had expired, and the remaining stragglers of the night had turned in for the night. The only movements came from the moonlight reflecting off the slightly tilting masks of the Umbu that watched over the unsuspecting village from the tiled rooftops. From below their anonymous masks, their breath came out in white wisps that quickly faded in the night air. At the base of the Hokage mountain was the Hokage's office. Heedless of the late hour, two figures stood stiffly in the dimly lit room. One was the Hokage, dressed in the white robes of his office as usual. The other was a tall, elderly man with bandages covering half his face. The way they stood was familiar, but tense. They had known each other for a very long time now, but their relationship had grown colder over the years as the difference in their opinions of how matters should be dealt had increasingly diverged. So you told the Jinchuriki the truth, said Danzo coolly. Hiruzen tiredly folded his hands together. Naruto already knew the truth. I owed him an explanation of it at the very least. What do you owe a Jinchuriki? Danzo scoffed. That was foolish of you. What if he turns against us? He won't, said Hiruzen. My sources tell me the boy isn't the type to be won over with flattery and praise. No. But underneath all of that, he is still just a boy. Hiruzen turned his head to look out the window at the Hokage monument. From where he stood, it was so close he could see the cracks along the carved mountainside. He gets along with his team, and Kakashi will treat him well. That's why I put him there. And ultimately, Konoha is his home, regardless of how he has been treated. He won't so easily turn his back on it. We'll see. With an expressionless look on his face and a curt nod of his head, Danzo left. Hiruzen watched his departure with calculating eyes. He could tell Danzo was up to something again. He would have to keep a closer eye on him. Whenever the man got that look on his face, something unexpected inevitably happened. Folding his hands behind his back, Hiruzen slowly walked over to the window on the other side of his office. From there, he could look out over the entirety of the village. It always filled his heart with warmth to see the civilians going about their daily activities, the ninja rushing around to hand in their missions or slack off at Ichiraku's, the children at the academy sparring with sweat on their brow. His gaze alighted on one particular rooftop. Its inhabitant was likely sleeping right now, but Hiruzen knew him to be one of the most gifted and hard-working genin, now chunin, in the village. In any other circumstance, the boy would have been widely praised and acknowledged for his genius and resourcefulness, but fate had not been kind to him. And yet, even so, he persevered. For the most part, Hiruzen hadn't lied to Danzo about Naruto. But there was one thing that he had said for the sole purpose of easing Danzo's paranoia, and that was that Naruto was just a boy. But he wasn't just a boy. Hiruzen may have been exaggerating at certain points at the time, but he hadn't been lying when he told Naruto that he saw a fire in him. At the moment, it was contained, but smoldering. Given time, he could see it turn into a great bonfire. He wondered though, was it really the will of fire? Or was it something else? Chapter 18, Day of Departure. Huff, huff. His lungs felt like they were on fire and his vision was starting to blur, but the man, gritting his teeth, continued to leap across the tree branches. Dark-toned and dressed in nondescript black clothes, he blended almost perfectly into the darkness of the night. The only thing that gave him away was the frayed scroll clutched in his hands that gleamed white under the stray rays of moonlight that interrupted the shade of the forest canopy. His heart thudding loudly in his chest, as sweat streamed down his face, the man cautiously looked behind him. He was alone. Letting out a tiny sigh of relief, the man felt some of the tension leaving his muscles. As the hot blood coursing through his veins began to slow down, he suddenly realized that the wind blowing strongly against his face was cold. At the thought, he slightly lowered his pace, letting himself catch his breath. The rumors were true, then. Konohagakure's security, once renowned as an impassable steel wall that blocked out all intruders, was no longer what it used to be. The past 15 years had not been kind to the village after all. Their most famous trio, the Sunin, had left the village, and in the invasion of the Ninetales, they'd lost their Yondaime Hokage, leaving behind the increasingly decrepit Sandaime to try and rebuild the village. He looked around, but there was still nothing, besides the occasional rustling of squirrels and birds lower down. His lips edged up in a triumphant smile. For a man past his prime, the Sandaime hadn't done such a shabby job, but the village's strength was nowhere near what had been at its peak. He hadn't even been questioned at the village entrance. The Chunin on gate duty had glanced at him once and then waved him in. Breaking into the archives had been just as easy, using a simple genjutsu to trick the Chunin at the desk into thinking he'd already left, and then slipping out just as the guards changed shifts. However, despite how smoothly the operation was going, the man had still grown antsy. He was in a ninja village after all, regardless of how much it'd fallen from its former glory, and almost slipped up when he was leaving the village. Just as he stepped into line behind several civilians at the exit gate, the entrance gate had creaked open to allow another stream of people in, and then the on-duty Chunin raised a hand in greeting. Another successful mission? Good job. Ah, I didn't do much this time, said a deep voice. Sure. Oh, Hokage-sama wants you in his office right away, Kakashi. Got it. At the sound of the infamous name, the man had frozen. Could it be the copy ninja himself? And slowly turned his head to see. When he saw the infamous silver hair and hetaite draped over the left eye, he swore to himself. He knew the mission had been going far too easily, it'd only been a matter of time for an unexpected setback. But it was just his luck to run into one of Konoha's most famous jonin right as he was about to leave. Forcing himself to stay calm, he'd looked away. His eyes landing on a shorter red-headed boy beside the jonin, his pounding heartbeat had slowly grown steadier. However, the boy must have felt his gaze, for he looked up and locked eyes with him, and for a second, he could have sworn that the boy knew exactly what he was and why he was there. But as the man felt a cold bead of sweat drip from his temple, the boy then looked away. The duo passed by, and the Chunin waved him out, and he was home free. Despite his success, he'd felt uneasy after seeing the copy ninja right under his nose, and he'd booked it as soon as the walls were out of sight. But now, it seemed that truly nobody in the village had noticed his intrusion. And even if they did find out, it was too late now to catch up to him, since he'd taken care even in his haste to cover up his tracks. The mission had been a success, then. Jubilantly, the man looked down at the scroll in his hand. It contained some of Konoha's forbidden techniques, an increasingly valuable commodity in the black market if you knew where to look. His target was a group slowly growing in infamy, called the Akatsuki, that had been buying out all such village forbidden techniques at prices above their competition. If he sold it to them at a good price, he'd be able to settle his debts with enough to spare. Maybe with the extra money, he'd drop by the hot springs at Yogakure. He'd heard there'd been an incident there a year or two ago, but things had been quiet since then. Surely it'd be safe now? And the food and the service there were always so good. Lots of good-looking women too. Suddenly, something heavy smashed into the back of the man's neck, and unable to react, he buckled. He'd been mid-jump so he felt his body hang momentarily in the air before it began to limply free-fall to the ground. As everything turned fuzzy and his vision faded into blackness, the last thing he saw was something red streak over him. Naruto had just turned over the unconscious outsider to the intelligence division, when a triumphant cry rang out from behind him. Turning around, he was greeted with an excited-looking Rai skidding to a stop before him. As the sight of his teammate, Naruto raised a critical eyebrow. In the 2 weeks they hadn't seen each other, it looked like the boy had again added at least another inch to his height. After they passed the exam, Rai, like him, had switched to more standard ninja attire, complete with a flak jacket, and in the other newly minted Chunin's case, a pair of blade weapons strapped across his back. However, as the months passed by, the already tall boy had hit yet another growth spurt, and now towered over Naruto, who, despite his best efforts, could still pass for an academy student playing dress-up. "I saw Kakashi-sensei just a few minutes ago," Rai said as a means of greeting, glancing curiously at the Chunin taking away the body. "He told me I'd find you here. We're wanted at the Hokage's office." Nodding in affirmation, Naruto began to briskly head down the mostly empty street towards the village center. Trotting along easily by his side, Rai looked around discreetly and then lowered his head. "So that's another B-rank mission done in record time," he whispered conspiratorially, a hand raised to cover his mouth. "I wasn't aware there was a record to be broken," Naruto answered absently, as he took mental inventory of his remaining equipment. "Oh, you don't know?" Pulling back, Rai rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The younger Chunin keep a running bet on how much time some of the longer missions will take. The general consensus was that it'd take you and Kakashi-sensei at least 3 weeks to finish that mission with the Fire Lord's treasurer, but I had faith in you guys. "You put money on us, didn't you?" said Naruto amusedly. Rai grinned gleefully, and held up 2 fingers in a victory pose. "I'll need those winnings if I don't want to be cleaned out, what with celebrating Mayu's promotion and all." "You're still celebrating?" Naruto raised his eyebrows. They'd received news of her passing the Chunin exam just before he had left for his most recent mission. "We didn't even start. We can't exactly celebrate without the entire Team 7, now can we?" Rai waved a hand dismissively. Naruto felt the corners of his mouth quirk upwards. "That's true." Smiling came easier to Naruto nowadays. He'd have thought that what with knowing the truth, or at least some of it, his situation would have grown more difficult, but on the contrary, life had proceeded fairly normally afterwards. Or as normal as life could get for a ninja with the 9 tails sealed inside him, anyways. Naruto wasn't winning any popularity contests, and he wasn't surprised that he hadn't known about the Chunin's betting games, for most of them tended to keep their distance from him, but both Rai and Mayu's relaxed attitude towards him had helped to ease some of the misgivings their new comrades may have had toward him. Their fellow Chunin didn't include him, but they didn't go out of their way to bother him, and that was all he wanted. His training sessions with Kakashi were also going, for the most part, as smoothly as one could expect, while repeatedly materializing highly dense quantities of chakra on a regular basis. He'd been able to stabilize the Rasengan to the extent that it didn't drain him, and had even begun experimenting with adding his elemental chakra to the mix, something which, according to Kakashi, the Fourth Hokage had never had the time to complete himself. But there was still an ever-present weight at the back of his mind. While it'd been over a year since Naruto had had his taboo seal removed, he had yet to regain any of his memories of the purported incident when he was 6. The few memories he'd lost in the Chunin exams had returned, but his 6th birthday was still a huge blank. Nor had he regained any other memories in between, meaning that they were either so insignificant that he hadn't noticed, that nothing had actually happened, or even worse, that they hadn't come back yet. Kakashi had tried to reassure him, confirming that the seal had really been removed, and that the memories would eventually return in the course of time. Still, it was unsettling, not knowing for sure whether his own memories were complete or not. Naruto glanced at Rai, who was now silently walking along with his arms crossed behind his head. There was also the matter of his teammates still not knowing about his Jinchuriki status. The problem was, he'd never found the time to do so. Ever since he'd been promoted to Chunin, his daily routine had become a never-ending cycle between training and missions. His remaining time was barely enough for him to sleep, eat, and carry out other basic necessities. With Rai also busy with his new Chunin duties and Mayu practicing hard for the next exam, the chance to bring up such a sensitive topic had just never come around. A small voice whispered to him that if he'd really wanted to, he could always turn down 1 or 2 missions and make time, but Naruto quickly quashed it. When they were let into the Hokage's office, Naruto was not surprised to find the 2 remaining members of Team 7 already waiting for them. Mayu, glowing in her new Chunin attire, and Kakashi, still in his dusty travel clothes, stood beside a pale black-haired Chunin he had never seen before. "Ah, Naruto, Rai," said the Hokage, lowering a smoking pipe from his wrinkled mouth. Good, you're all here now. The two bowed shortly in the elder shinobi's direction. Raising his head, Rai curiously stared at the strange Chunin. You wanted us, Hokage-sama. I realize you've just returned from a long mission. As he spoke, the Hokage nodded at Kakashi and Naruto in turn. However, with tension escalating between nation borders right now, client requests are at a peak and our manpower stretched thin. I've spoken to Kakashi and he's agreed to accepting this next mission. But if you'd like some rest, Naruto, I am willing to let you sit out on this next mission. That will be unnecessary, Hokage-sama, said Naruto immediately. The mission had been long but tedious, and he still had plenty of energy left over. With Kakashi and his teammates gone, he'd have little to do in Konoha by himself, anyways. At his response, the Hokage leaned back in his chair with a contemplative look on his face. Very well, then. I've got here an urgent mission that will require you all to start out by early morning tomorrow. Naruto, Mayu, and Rai, you three will be teaming up with another Chunin on a B-rank bodyguard mission to Wave Country. Wait, what about Kakashi-sensei? Rai cut in, looking put out. The Hokage passed his smoking pipe to his hand. Kakashi is being sent on another mission into Earth Country. On this mission, Naruto will be your team leader. A Jonin standing beside the Hokage stepped forward to hand them their mission scrolls. Unfurling his, Naruto quickly scanned the contents. It was short but clear. It was a standard escort mission that had earned B rank simply due to the fact that the client was a semi-well-known merchant. Considering the current smuggling situation with Gato in Wave Country, it wouldn't be unexpected for the client to be targeted by minor bandits and ruffians on the journey. It was nothing any properly trained ninja couldn't handle, but dangerous for civilian travelers on the road, thus warranting the recent rise in demands for bodyguards. Naruto glanced at the wan-faced Chunin standing beside Kakashi. The boy, dressed in all black with a tanto strapped across his back, looked only 1 or 2 years older than him, but Naruto had never seen him in the academy before. Is that the Chunin we'll be teaming up with? Indeed, this is Sai, the Hokage said, with a simple gesture towards the boy, whose face split into a wide smile. Its intended purpose may have been to disarm, but to Naruto, it looked more eerie and offsetting than anything. Hiya, said Sai, with a wave. Turning to Mayu, he held out a hand. So you must be, Mayu, was it? With a shy nod, Mayu raised her hand. His smile grew even bigger. Wow, you've got a really forgettable face, don't you? Mayu froze. Snarling something incomprehensible, Rai took a step forward, but stopped when Naruto firmly grabbed his arm. You must be Naruto, said Sai, turning to him with a look of delight. Looking forward to working with you, short stuff. Naruto let go of Rai. After a beat, he stepped forward to grip the other boy's hand. Likewise. After receiving a few more mission details from the Hokage, they began to all file out of the room, when the Hokage cleared his throat. Naruto. He paused. Mayu and Rai stopped as well, but the Hokage shook his head. I'd like to talk to him privately for a minute. Once the door had clicked shut, Naruto turned to the elder shinobi. Yes, Hokage-sama. You may be wondering why I'm sending you without a Jonin's supervision. Naruto nodded. It's only been a year since you became a Chunin, but your name has come up several times for a Jonin appointment. Your skills certainly would match up well. The only thing you're missing is experience in leading missions, as you've always been paired with Kakashi. So I'm putting you in charge of the other 3, this should be a good learning experience for you. Understood, Hokage-sama. Naruto wasn't surprised, and in fact, welcomed the promotion. Being a Jonin would mean he would get more challenging missions, have higher clearance in the archives, and best of all, he wouldn't have to report to anyone besides the Hokage. Naturally, my council is not pleased with my decision to grant you more autonomy, but they've grudgingly acknowledged your good work this past year. However, they pushed me to add this Sai to your team, and I saw no reason to deny them, but I want you to always be aware that his role is to be their watchdog and to report back to them anything he learns about you. I assume you know what this means. Yes, sir. Clearly, the Hokage wanted Naruto to gather information on Sai at the same time he was being observed. Lastly, I sent Team Shirakumo to Wave Country just yesterday, so if you do run into trouble, you should find friendly faces at a reachable distance. Don't let your pride stop you from taking advantage of that. Yes, sir, said Naruto slowly. With a satisfied nod from the Hokage, he was dismissed. Turning sharply around on his heel, he left the room. Walking down the empty hallway, his thoughts turned to the journey that lay before him. It would be his first long-distance mission without Kakashi. He wasn't nervous about whether he was up for it, since the Jonin had always preferred to take the backseat and let Naruto handle most of the dirty work. But it was a little strange to realize that this time around, if he somehow mishandled things, his teacher wouldn't be around to clean up after him. Naruto frowned, clenching his hands tightly. Such a feeble mindset wouldn't do. He'd sworn to get stronger since he'd lost in the final round of the Chunin exams, and now, a year later, this was the first test to truly prove his own mettle to himself. There would be no ifs about it, he would fulfill the mission, period. As he stepped out of the building, he was surprised to see the rest of his team waiting for him. Seemingly having gotten over the less than optimal introduction in the Hokage's office, Rai was grinning widely, and even in the dim lighting, Naruto could make out Mayu's red cheeks. About time, said Rai, pouncing at him. He began to drag Naruto down the street. Come on, I'm starving. There's really no need, Mayu protested, Kakashi following languidly behind her. What are you talking about? I promised you a meal if you passed the Chunin exams, remember? Mayu flushed even more, the very tips of her ears turning red. So? Ramen or tonkatsu? Which will it be? Ramen, said Naruto, raising a hand obediently. Mayu smiled despite herself. Ramen sounds good. Ramen it is, then, said Kakashi cheerfully. Then full steam ahead. Rai crowed, pumping his fist in the air. The next morning, having already packed his essentials, Naruto was out the door as soon as he'd eaten his cereal. The wind felt good on his skin as he made his way to the front gate, and a small smile crept unbidden to his lips. Last night's dinner with his team had done him some good, he felt refreshed and ready. Their client was waiting for them at the gate, and as Naruto took in her appearance, his eyebrows inadvertently rose. Known as the merchant Toru, he'd expected a typically overweight man sporting a ring on each fat finger. In reality, however, she was a thin, freckled woman dressed in baggy journeyman clothes who looked like she could be closer to his age than to Kakashi's. I asked for bodyguards, and I got a bunch of kids. She frowned, her foot tapping impatiently on the ground. We're all qualified Chunin, said Naruto in what he hoped was a reassuring tone. But the merchant's frown deepened. Shouldn't you all be in school or something? Shouldn't you be at your appointment with the plastic mednin? Sai returned with a pleasant smile. Mayu let out a squeak of disbelief, but to Naruto's surprise, the merchant smiled toothily back. Not so gutless, then. All right, I'll take you lot. She kicked the bulky knapsack by her side, which made a thunking sound upon contact. You there with the scar, you can carry this for me. With a scowl, Rai easily shouldered the bag on top of his own. The merchant clapped her hands together. So, are you all ready? I'd like to cover a lot of ground before lunch. Mayu looked around curiously. Are we going by foot? Aren't you a merchant? It's hardly worth paying the fee to ferry a wagon across the sea to Wave Country, and besides, I've got all my goods right here. The merchant gestured towards the bag Rai was now holding. From the sound it had made when she'd kicked it, it was a wooden box, but the contents were a mystery as far as Naruto was concerned. Not that it mattered, Toru was known to be a supplier of an eclectic variety of goods, ranging from precious jewels to dusty tomes, but all his mission required of him was to take her in one piece to Wave Country. Come on then, let's get moving. Taking surprisingly large strides, the merchant began to head toward the opening gates. Hefting his bag higher on his shoulder, Naruto followed, the others right at his heel. Idly seated on top of a tree branch, Kakashi put his book down as he watched from afar Naruto and the rest of his team leaving the village. He'd be leaving too, in about half a day, to follow them. What the Hokage had said about his going on a mission to Earth Country had been a nice bit of misdirection, both for Naruto and for Danzo's little spy's sake, but his real mission had been to trail Naruto's team. The Hokage was obviously making a big show out of showing Naruto that he had trust in him and had told Kakashi it was for the sake of observing Naruto's leadership ability, but he knew, and the Hokage knew that he knew, that the reality was that he could not afford to have their Jinchuriki running around in unknown territory unsupervised. Kakashi had agreed because he'd felt uneasy about leaving Naruto alone with a member of Root, but despite himself, he felt a tweak of guilt at the thought of deceiving his student. All the more reason not to get caught, he supposed. It's been a while since we last went to the hot springs like this, Rai remarked, a note of wistfulness evident in his tone as they peered up at the wooden sign. It'd been a week since they had headed out, and although they had made several stops here and there at various cities, they'd made good time with only a few minor scuffles. They had reached the border of Fire Country around noon at the end of the 7th day, and since the boats that ferried people to the Land of Waves only operated in the morning, they had turned in early for the day. As a treat, the merchant, who'd turned out to be a shrewd, but mostly friendly sort of person, was letting them stay at a traditional type inn, complete with yukata and hot springs. It promised to be an experience not unlike that of Yugakure from 2 years ago, but this time, hopefully without the crazed renegade ninja. Waving goodbye to Mayu and the merchant, Naruto and the other 2 boys made their way to the men's section. Stripping down and scrubbing themselves in the bath, they then dipped down in the bubbling water of the hot springs. The only other occupants were a scattered number of elderly men, and a father with his young son in the shallow end. He couldn't completely rule them out as potential assailants, of course, but he didn't think he needed to be on high alert. Judging by the looks of it, the pair in the opposite end couldn't have had more than a handful's amount of teeth between the 2 of them. But more importantly, their hands, which were resting along the wall, looked unscarred and relatively uncalloused. They were hardly that of a ninja used to a lifetime of handling weapons. His soaked towel resting on his head, Naruto relaxed, feeling some of the tension leave his muscles. Beside him, Rai let out a contented sigh. Remember when we tried to make Kakashi-sensei take his mask off? His arms behind his head, Rai leaned back against the stone wall of the tub. Man, it feels like forever ago. And we never did figure out what he looks like. I've seen it, said Naruto casually. With a splash, Rai's towel fell into the water as he incredulously leaped to his feet. What? How? We were on a mission together, and I walked in on him brushing his teeth one morning, he explained to the other boys' astonishment. So? Rai prodded him. What did he look like? Did he have a huge scar? Was he ugly? Now you're just talking about yourself, Sai interjected with a placid smile. Some of the eagerness fading from his face, Rai shot him a nasty look. I wasn't talking to you, you pasty little. Can you sit down? Your dick's hanging in my face. Turning red, Rai opened his mouth, but Naruto reached up and gave his arm a warning squeeze. After a pause, looking disgruntled, Rai nevertheless sat back down with a splash. After a few more minutes of soaking in the hot water, Naruto excused himself, leaving the 2 boys glaring daggers at each other, or rather, Rai was, while Sai continued to smile amiably at nothing in particular. Changing into a yukata that the inn had provided, he covered his wet hair in a towel and left to take a cursory look around the inn's grounds. It was then that he noticed someone hunched over in front of the wooden fence that separated the men's bath from the women's bath. It was a large man with shaggy white hair cascading down his back. He was peering through a small crack in between the slats of the fence and laughing delightedly to himself. What caught Naruto's eye, however, was the large scroll strapped to the man's back. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like a summoning scroll. But before he could decide what to do, the man let out another cackle, and reached into his kimono to pull out an orange book that Naruto immediately recognized as one of Kakashi's favorite reads. As he did so, he noticed Naruto staring at him, and his face immediately turned grave. Holding up a finger to his mouth, he made a slitting motion across his throat in a clear promise of death. The man then returned his undivided attention to the spectacle that lay beyond the fence. After a pause, Naruto walked past. Chapter 19, Heaven-Shaking Event. The attack came under cover of mist. After an early night's rest at the inn, Naruto and the others had risen before the sun, and gotten on board one of the very first boats to Wave Country, a small but sturdy wooden fishing boat, manned by a self-professed freelance poet wearing a woven straw hat. The fog grew steadily thicker as they approached the small island country, and the only sound Naruto could hear was the rhythmic sloshing of the ore as it sliced through the water's surface, made opaque by the reflection of the overcast mist. The conversation, which had been scant to begin with, had all but died down in the face of the grey morning. Rai had fallen asleep again, and even as Naruto watched, a trickle of drool silently made its way down the side of his face. It was just as well that Rai had been sitting next to Toru, for just as Naruto reached out to shake the other boy awake, a pair of pale, slimy hands shot out from outside the boat and seized the merchant by the shoulders. A look of shock and then fear flashing in quick succession across her face, she mutely toppled backwards, breaking the surface of the water with a loud splash. While Mayu and Sai jumped to their feet, with a yelp, the boatman ducked behind them. Naruto managed to lean across Rai in time to grab her ankle with his already outstretched hand. Before he could lose his grip or be pulled over himself, he dug his elbow into Rai's chest, and planting his feet against the wall of the boat, he pulled back, feeling the strain in his arms immediately. As Rai choked and wheezed back into consciousness below him, two more dark shadows suddenly burst out of the water from the other side of the boat, and from their hands split off a multitude of smaller shadows that flew straight toward them. Mayu and Sai, with a kunai in each hand, hovered protectively in wait. Rai! Naruto shouted out, as the piercing sound of metal striking metal resounded across the water's surface. His eyes immediately focusing, Rai reached upwards with a grunting sound and wrapped his arms around the merchant's kicking legs. Sticking his head in between, Rai leaned forward, gritting his teeth. Letting go of Toru's legs, Naruto quickly made the necessary combination of signs with his freed hands, noting with some anxiety that with the merchant's head underwater, her struggling had started to weaken. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shadow Clone Technique. In a burst of white cloud, two clones appeared by his side, and they both immediately dove into the water. As they did so, Naruto rejoined Rai's efforts and grabbing Toru around the torso, he pulled back. After a few seconds, with his clones keeping the underwater assailant busy, the opposing pull on the other end suddenly gave way, and as they fell backwards, the merchant's head resurfaced with a wet gasp. Her body tumbling back onto the boat, she hunched over on all fours immediately, shaking and coughing out water. Meanwhile, Sai had pulled out a scroll, and with a flourish of his brush, a pair of white and black drawings that Naruto quickly identified as bats had burst out of the page. They disappeared into the fog, in which he could already hear the sound of bluebirds twittering, and shortly afterwards, the storm of shuriken came to a halt. Futon, Kyavua, wind release, gale. A strong wind swept into existence, sweeping away the fog surrounding the boat, and revealing nothing but a recently disturbed surface. As if in response, Naruto's two clones popped their heads above the water, and as he dispelled them and gained their memories, he let out a sigh. They got away, he told the others, though it was mainly for the merchant's benefit. Mayu's bluebirds had already returned and were perched on her shoulders, pecking lightly at her nape. They were ninja, weren't they? Rai said, his eyes narrowing. What village were they from? They weren't wearing any identifiable markers, said Mayu, as she petted a bird with her finger. With a whisper, they swirled back into hair clips that returned to her hair. Naruto crossed his arms. They were mercenaries, but it's strange. They were a cut above the ones that VE attacked us before. He broke off at the sound of strangled coughing. Naruto turned to see Toru on all fours again. Water and bile were dripping from her mouth. Toru-san. Are you alright? Asked Mayu, rushing over to the woman's side. I'm fine, said Toru weakly, her face still pale. Naruto noticed that near her collarbone was a sizable hand-shaped bruise that was already growing purple. Naruto turned toward the boatman. How far are we from our destination? I'm fine, I said, Toru insisted, even as she bent over the side of the boat, making a gagging sound. We're not that far from port, the boatman offered helplessly. So long as we aren't attacked again, we should see land in 2 hours. She's a civilian, a head wound like that needs to be looked at immediately, said Mayu, shaking her head. Naruto's gaze shot back to Toru, and he immediately spotted the blood on her scalp. Hesitantly, he opened his mouth. Rai stood up. I can carry her and run the rest of the way. I was the least useful in that fight. Might as well show my worth now. Aha, so you do have some sense of self-awareness, said Sai, with an indulging smile. Your development isn't as regressive as I feared, but still, futile. Your carrying her would jostle her skull and make it even worse. You got a better idea then? Rai demanded, but Sai had already pulled out his scroll once more. Dipping a brush in ink, his hand blurred across the page, and a large black and white bird was soon unfurling its wings before them. Sai clambered onto its back, and Rai and Naruto carefully picked up the merchant, who was now too weak to protest, and laid her behind him. Sai quickly drew something on his scroll, and this time, a long snake burst into existence, which he used like a rope to fasten Toru into position behind him. Please don't get killed on the way back, now, said Sai, as the bird rose into the air. There'd be too much paperwork to do by myself. Just before they reached shore, a black and white fish popped its head out of the water, and when Naruto opened an empty scroll, it turned into black calligraphy that seeped into the page. There at the house of an acquaintance, Naruto read off the message. There'll be someone waiting for us nearby the bridge. A bridge? Rai repeated skeptically. What's an itty-bitty little place like that need a bridge for? It isn't a complete bridge, the boatman said, pausing his rowing to adjust his straw hat. Tajuna is building a bridge to connect Wave Country to Fire Country. That'd put you out of a job, wouldn't it? Said Rai, in a rare moment of astuteness. The boatman shrugged. This is only one of my many jobs. If there was a bridge to connect our country to Fire Country, our economy would improve, and other opportunities would open up. And Gato wouldn't like that, would he? Naruto said. The boatman shook his head. Gato? Like the shipping magnate? Rai said incredulously. Then were the ones who attacked us earlier Gato's men? Mayu asked in a hushed voice. It's not impossible. But why would he specifically target a common merchant with barely anything in her hands? Naruto looked down at Toru's knapsack, which had been left behind. As a B-rank mission, he'd expected some tussles along the way of course, but that recent attack had been different. It had been planned ahead of time, and the fact that they had been able to attack and slip away so easily showed that they weren't ordinary mercenaries. But as he had voiced aloud, the question was, why would they target their client? Was Toru somehow involved with the bridge? When he realized that no one had answered his question yet, Naruto looked up and saw immediately what had silenced everyone. From the thick fog which had been obstructing much of their view, a gigantic uncompleted bridge had suddenly emerged. It towered above them as their boat quietly slipped between its legs. Coming down from far above, Naruto could hear the distant sounds of hammering and clanging. When Naruto and the others finally stepped on dock, they immediately spotted Sai, who was seated along the water's edge, drawing something in a small notebook. They waved goodbye to the boatman, who tipped his hat in farewell before rowing away. That took a while, said Sai, closing the notebook shut and climbing to his feet. I was beginning to wonder whether I should be ordering extra coffins. When Mayu's face paled and her mouth opened, he smiled. Just kidding. The merchant is doing fine. She just needs some rest. With that, they began to follow Sai along a dusty but well-trodden path that led away from the bridge. The mist dwindled rapidly as they got further away from the water side, and soon, they were walking past a rickety routing sign and into a settlement with rows of wooden buildings alongside a thin river that cut through its middle. The paint on the rooftops looked like they could have been bright once, but had dulled and chipped away, while some buildings were not even graced with a rooftop, and were instead covered with what looked like cotton sails. Most of the buildings were short, as if clinging to the ground, but at their center was one tall building which spiraled out to a watch post at its tip. The streets were busy, but not with the hubbub of an afternoon market. The majority of the people there were walking along dejectedly in their straw hats, looking as if they had nothing else to do. Some wore sandwich signs that advertised their willingness for any type of job, while others dazedly lay sprawled out along the sides of the street with a half-empty bottle in their hands. Mayu stopped at one point, when they passed by a group of small children sitting hunched over against a wall, but was pulled away by Rai. As the others followed Sai inside what looked like a grocery store, Naruto paused as for some odd reason, he felt like he was being watched. Then, his hand whipped out and firmly grabbed the wrist of a bony man whose hand had been straying too close to the bag on his back. Careful, he said, giving the wrist a warning squeeze before letting go. With an answering yelp, the man scampered away and disappeared into the throng of people passing by. For several moments, Naruto waited with narrowed eyes, but the sensation that he was being watched had disappeared. He frowned. Were the people of this village really so poor and broken as to try and rob a, seemingly, defenseless child in bright daylight? He'd visited a large variety of places with Kakashi over the past year, but never somewhere as pitiful as this one. The store's bell clanged as Naruto entered, and he'd barely been able to take in the scarcity of the nearly empty shelves before he realized that his teammates were talking to a bespectacled old man with a towel wrapped around his neck and a girl in an eye-catching red kippah. She looked vaguely familiar with her long pink hair, and she was wearing a leaf he tied like a hairband. "Ah, and there's our team leader," said Rai, gesturing toward him. The old man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "I don't think I even saw this many kids in the entire village while I was there," he said exasperatedly, though not unpleasantly. "You ninjas sure start out young." "Who are you?" asked Naruto, looking curiously at the odd pair. "I'm Tajuna, Master Bridge Builder," said the old man, tipping his straw hat with some pride. Naruto nodded, his thoughts turning to the bridge they'd seen as they docked. "I'm Sakura. I'm here with Team Shirakumo," said the girl, and Naruto nodded again, remembering that the Hokage had told him about them. Her eyes flitted to the leaf he tied on their foreheads, and lit up. "So you four are all from Konoha too, huh?" She scanned their faces, and to Naruto's surprise, paused at his. A look of recognition flashed across her face. "Oh, I remember you. You were in my class for a bit, weren't you? At the academy? The quiet one. Oh wow, I actually forgot, Naruto, you were transferred to our class late, huh?" said Rai, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Naruto had stopped paying attention to his classmates early on, so he couldn't say he remembered Sakura, but he did vaguely remember having once sparred against a girl with her hair color. However, without responding, Naruto looked straight at Sakura. "If you're on an escort mission, why are you still here?" Immediately in response, Sakura looked away and bit her lip, while Tajuna coughed uncomfortably. "This sort of talk would be better kept behind closed doors," said Tajuna, directing a meaningful look towards the shopkeeper. "I'd invite you to my home, but it looks like you already have somewhere to be." The others looked at Sai, who shrugged and pointed at a small stairway near the counter. "We're already here." Exchanging a few words with the shopkeeper, a short man who looked nervously around the store's premises, they headed up the stairs, which creaked at every step. Sai knocked 4 times on the door, and after a few seconds, they heard the sound of shuffling. The door opened a crack to reveal an eye, before opening to reveal Toru, whose head was swathed in bandages. Her face seemed to have regained some of its previous color. She stepped back, ushering them in with a quick wave of her hand. "Quick, come on in. Nobody's supposed to know I'm here." She trailed off as she finally saw Tajuna standing at the edge of the group. He gaped back at her, his glasses hanging askew. "Kane." With a blank look on her face, Toru regarded Tajuna silently before finally heaving a sigh. She opened the door wider in a sign of invitation. "You'd better come in, then," she said quietly. Inside was a small, clean 3-room apartment not unlike Naruto's own home in Konoha, but judging by the poverty of the rest of the village, it might have been considered luxurious. Toru, or Kane, disappeared into the kitchen, and with Maya helping, distributed cups of tea for all of them. With everyone sipping from the hot tea, the story soon came out. "My real name is Kane," said the merchant. "And as I'm sure you've deduced by now, I am being targeted by Gato for being an accomplice of the bridge's construction." "So you were our mysterious benefactor," Tajuna said heavily, looking down at his untouched cup. "Why didn't you tell us? What good would that have done?" snapped Kane. "Whenever you weren't working on the bridge, you were just a bumbling, drunk fool of an old man." "The past year hasn't been kind to you," said Tajuna, not rising to the taunt. "At least I'm still alive," she retorted. "Which is better than what I can say about my dear brother." There was a pregnant pause, while Sai appeared to be gazing at the design of the teacups with some fascination. Sakura and Mayu stared wide-eyed at the hard-faced merchant woman. Rai uncomfortably gulped down his tea, and Naruto followed suit, taking his first sip of the drink. It was bitter. "You are angry with me," said Tajuna at last. "For being alive?" Kane's head snapped back as if she'd been slapped. Why would I be? You wish I'd been the one executed instead of Kaiza, said Tajuna. This time, it was Kane's turn to be silent. Who's Kaiza? Asked Sakura awkwardly, raising a hand as if she were in class. The hero of this city, Tajuna answered, and at the same time, Kane said, my brother. Kane's mouth thinned into a single line, and Tajuna took off his glasses to wipe it with his sleeve before continuing. He married my daughter, and became my grandson Inari's father. They were like a true father and son, and inseparable, but when Gato took over, he stood up to them. And for that, he was executed in front of everyone. Kaiza was the bravest man I ever knew, and died because of it. My brother wasn't brave, sneered Kane, her hands visibly tightening over her cup. He couldn't protect his first family, so he ran away to Wave Country and thought he'd redeem himself by playing at being a hero, only to get killed, but I suppose compared to you, he was brave. She raised her eyes aggressively toward the older man. He didn't cower behind a fence, watching as an innocent man got murdered. He didn't sit complacently at home, drinking himself silly and venturing out only when someone gave him some coin. He wasn't brave, but he wasn't a coward like you. That's not true. Sakura burst out angrily. Even though it was dangerous, Tajuna-san came all the way to Fire Country. On the way to Wave Country, we even got attacked by a missing nin named Zabuza. Naruto's eyes widened, and from beside him, Rai spit out a mouthful of tea. A missing nin. Mayu repeated, growing pale. Naruto didn't recognize the name, but by principle, all missing nin were dangerous. Any ninja who could leave their village without being caught by their village's hunter nin had to be at least Jonin level. Sakura jumped to her feet, looking upset. Even Shirakumo-sensei got injured during the battle. But after all that, Tajuna-san went right back to the bridge to continue working on it. Another man quit today, but he still isn't giving up. That's all right, Sakura, said Tajuna, though he looked rather touched. What Kane is saying isn't wrong. If you can realize that, then I have nothing else to say to you, said Kane, white-faced. Please leave. At her words, Tajuna's form sagged, making him look even older than he had before. But without protest, he nodded. Leaving his tea still untouched, he reached for his straw hat, which he had hung neatly on a chair. He paused before the door. Thank you for your funding, Kane. If this bridge is completed, this city, no, the entire country will be in debt to you. With a nod to Naruto and the others, he left. Shooting them a final pleading look, Sakura followed him. Several minutes after the door had closed shut, Naruto got to his feet. Keeping his voice neutral, he said, well, we have to get going now. I apologize for your injury, but if you want to file any complaints about our work, you'll have to contact our village by post. Mayu and Rai jumped at his words. Slowly shaking her head, Kane reached into her pocket to pull out a handful of coins. No, your work was satisfactory. This should cover your passage back to Konoha. She averted her gaze. Thank you for escorting me here. I wouldn't have made it without you kids. Rai hurried to drain the rest of his tea, and the rest rose to their feet. After a few murmured farewells, they left the apartment. Hey, Naruto, said Rai hesitantly, as the store's bell clanged behind them. He looked up at the building with a troubled expression. Can we really just leave it like this? Naruto glanced back. Our mission was to escort her to Wave Country. There was nothing about staying here and helping her clean up her life. I guess you're right, said Rai, his face clearing up. It's not like we could do much about it, anyways. They began to walk away, but a few seconds later, Naruto stopped, realizing that Mayu hadn't moved. She was picking at the tail of her hair in the way she did when she was anxious about something, and her eyes seemed fixed on something. Following her gaze, he saw that she was staring straight at a small, hungry-looking girl begging for food on the other side of the street. Naruto suppressed a sigh. Mayu, Rai started, but she suddenly put up a hand, silencing him. You heard what Sakura said, Mayu said quietly. Their sensei, Shirakumo-sensei, is injured. That's probably why they're still here. Can we really just go without helping them? They're from Konoha too. So this isn't about the orphans at all, Rai said sarcastically, crossing his arms. Or about Tajuna and that mess with Gato. Mayu turned pink. So what if it is? We're ninja, not philanthropists, Rai hissed. Sai drew in a sharp breath, and they all automatically turned toward him. Did you sense something? Naruto asked, looking around. The feeling that he was being watched had returned, but there were too many people milling around for him to pinpoint the source. Sai shrugged. I was just taken aback that he knew such a big word, but you should probably stop talking so loudly about all this. We're drawing attention to ourselves. Before Rai could retort something back, Naruto put a hand on his shoulder. Sai's right about people watching. Calm down. He turned to Mayu and lowered his voice. But Rai is right too. We're not philanthropists. Our mission's complete. We don't know anything about the situation besides what we've just heard from two biased sources, and there's little we can do about it. Involving ourselves would mean involving Konoha in a foreign territorial dispute, and the village would lose face with clients. In truth, Naruto couldn't care less about the village's reputation, but he figured playing to Mayu's sense of loyalty would have more effect than the real reason why he wanted to leave. There was the desire to quickly return to Konoha and rack up points for another successfully completed mission, but more than that, this seaside city made him uneasy. It could have been the way he kept feeling like he was being watched, or it could have been the dead look in everyone's eyes, but whatever the source was, Naruto had been itching to leave as soon as he'd set foot in the city. It was a pity about Kane, but Naruto had barely known her for a week, and did not feel the urge to lay down the lives of his teammates in exchange for her continued safety, a safety that, indeed, well exceeded the conditions of their mission. Because the truth of the matter was, his every nerve was screaming at him that it wasn't safe here. Every minute spent here only increased the chances of there being an irreversible danger, and to Naruto's chagrin, he didn't know if he was strong enough yet to protect the team. He knew he had gotten stronger over the past year with his extensive tutelage under Kakashi, but he had yet to win any of their frequent bouts against each other. And if there was one thing he had learned over the past year on their missions together, it was that the world was large and crawling with unknown powerful enemies. There were many weak ninja, but there were just as many strong ninja. And without the rules that he'd come to be familiar with in the village and the academy, without the regulations and expectations that, no matter how vaguely, governed the Chunin exam, and without Kakashi acting as an ever-present reassuring shield, Naruto found himself questioning what he was and wasn't capable of, knowing that if he overestimated their abilities, there would be no return trip back to Konoha, outside of a coffin, if their enemies were so kind. Is this what the pressure of being a team leader is? He wondered. But Shirakumo-sensei. Shirakumo-sensei is a jonin, Mayu, said Rai, in a slightly calmer voice. Sakura's team should be fine, so long as they don't stick their noses in anything more. Are we going to go or not? Said Sai, managing to look bored even as he smiled. Mayu bowed her head, and with some relief, Naruto turned around. He raised a foot to step forward, when to his surprise, she said, no. Mayu. Rai asked uncertainly. You heard what she said? Toru, no, Kane-san is still in danger. What kind of ninja are we, if we abandon her here? She raised her head, and Naruto was stunned to find that her eyes were blazing. I'm going to stay with Kane-san, and I'm going to find Sakura's team and see what I can do to help. Mayu, Rai began, but was cut off once more as Mayu held up a hand. She looked piercingly at them. Naruto suddenly realized that her eyes were hazel, not brown, and then when, against all expectations, she smiled, Rai actually took a step back. I'm sorry for being so selfish, she said. But I've never been more grateful that I'm a ninja than I am right now. Without another word, Mayu turned around and disappeared into the store. The bell sounded behind her like a death knell, and Naruto and Rai mutely stared at the closing door with, for once, identically astonished expressions on their faces. Did that just happen? Rai finally let out weakly. Where did that come from? Is that what they call premenstrual syndrome? Sai cocked his head, with what looked like a genuinely curious look fixed on his face. Naruto. Rai turned to him with a pleading look, and for once, he found himself unable to think of what to say. When Sakura opened the door to the ramshackle house beside the windmill and found Mayu beaming back, with Rai, Naruto, and Sai awkwardly hovering behind, She flung it wide open with a look of delight, and the two girls rushed into each other's arms as if they hadn't met for the first time just a few hours ago. "I didn't think you'd stay behind," exclaimed Sakura. "Of course we'd want to help a fellow leaf ninja in need," Mayu said, clasping her hands together. "Isn't that right, guys?" Rai scratched his face. Yeah. Totally." "No," said Sai. Naruto didn't respond, his mind furiously working to try and salvage the situation. It wasn't new for Mayu to disapprove of one of his decisions, but she had always deferred to them, until now. After the initial shock, his immediate thought had been to order her as team leader to return, and if that proved insufficient, to resort to whatever physical means necessary. And perhaps even just a year ago, Naruto may have gone ahead and done just that. But now, as the thought of how Mayu might look at him for it floated into his mind, feeling a tightening in his chest, he dismissed it. Even if it were at the cost of a mission, he didn't know if he could bear either of his teammates looking at him in that way ever again. "What's happened to me?" Naruto thought frustratedly to himself. Meanwhile, as Sakura uncertainly took in their less than enthusiastic expressions, a male voice called out from another room, "Sakura? Who are they?" "They're Chunin from Konoha," Sakura responded, and a few seconds later, a curious-looking blonde boy in a black t-shirt stepped out. He looked them over with a rather suspicious glint in his eyes, which only slightly cleared at the sight of their leaf Hitai. "How do you know for sure?" the boy asked cagily. "They could be Gato's goons, for all we know." Without pause, he turned around, and cupping his hand around his mouth, he said, "Hey, Sasuke. Come here for a sec. You recognize any of them?" Another boy, this time dark-haired, stepped out from the other room, and with an equally wary look in his eyes, he looked at Naruto and his teammates. After a pause, he pointed a finger straight at Naruto. "That one. I remember him." "Geez, Menma," said Sakura, shaking her pink head exasperatedly. "He was in our class for a year. How could you forget?" "Oh, was he?" The boy let out an easy laugh, raising a hand to his neck in embarrassment. "My bad." Chapter 20, Foreboding Skies. He plodded down the path, looking with some disbelief at the hand that was pulling him along. It was warm and felt nothing like anything else he'd ever held before, but it was nice, he supposed. "What's wrong?" The girl stopped to look down at him, but the sun was high in the sky and shone too brightly down on them for him to make out her face. "And nothing," he said quietly. "Where are we going?" The word "we" felt alien to him, and he had to say it twice to confirm to his brain that it was indeed the word he was looking for. "You said you've never played hide-and-seek before, right?" she said, tucking a length of hair behind her ear. "I found a fun place to play it, and thought you might like it too." "Play?" he asked shyly. "I've never done that before, with someone else I mean." She laughed. "You're so weird. Who's never played with someone else before?" When he didn't respond, her smile slowly faded from her face. An odd look flashed across her face. Her mouth began to open, and he squeezed his eyes shut, afraid that she'd say something awful and leave him there like everyone else, when suddenly, another voice called out to them. "What are you doing? And who's that?" He opened his eyes and saw an older boy walking across the street towards them. He had a curious look on his tanned face. "This is the boy my mom's taking care of," said the girl, raising a hand in greeting. She gestured back to him with her other hand. "Come on, say hello." Hello," he murmured nervously. "Hold on, I know him," said the boy, leaning right down to stare at his face. He shrunk back. "Yeah, he's the one Kayamo's mom told us to stay away from." "Really? Why?" "I dunno," the boy shrugged, crossing his arms behind his head. "She got mad at Kayamo for letting him join our game of tag." "Why would she? He's just a kid like us." The girl smiled down at him again. "Right, Naruto." Naruto's eyes flew open. Faint motes of light was streaming through the half-open window, and for a long minute, he looked up at the ceiling. A tattered string dangled from the lone light fixture, and as he watched, it swayed in an invisible breeze. Only when his heartbeat had slowed down, did he get up. As Naruto got to his feet, The thin blanket he'd been sleeping under fell off, and at the soft sound, the others in the room began to stir. Stretching his arms, he silently walked to the window and pushed it open the rest of the way. They had spent the night at Tajuna's seaside house, and from the window, Naruto could see the waves jostling gently against the dock. And just barely, he could hear the sound of seagulls. The first time he'd visited the sea on one of his missions several months back, he had been taken aback at the high-pitched wailing sound. It sounded nothing like the birds around Konoha, and even more startlingly, it was accompanied by the underlying deep crashing noise of the waves as they pounded down on shore. But he'd quickly come to enjoy it, despite the cacophony of each separate sound. Together, they melded together and somehow soothed him. Being near the sea was an experience completely alien to Naruto, having grown up in a landlocked village like Konoha, but somehow, it felt familiar to him, as if he were meeting an old friend. As he stood there now, however, it had the opposite effect. The seagulls calling back and forth to each other sounded like a warning. It made him uneasy and restless. It was a strange and uncomfortable feeling that tingled almost unbearably across the surface of his skin. "We need to get out of here," he thought to himself. Sakura's team leader Shirakumo, a stern-faced jonin with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, had turned out to be recovering from a deep leg wound. However, it was healing well, and the jonin would likely be able to move around freely with just a few more days of rest. With that out of the way, there was no real reason for them to stay behind in this country, and after the night's rest, Naruto's mind felt clearer. His worries about Mayu resenting him for ordering her back to Konoha seemed silly to him now. She was not so unreasonable as to completely ignore the voice of reason. Surely she would listen to him with just a little more prodding? "Naruto!" called out a drowsed voice. He turned around to see Rai getting to his feet with half-lidded eyes, audibly cracking his neck. Sai was already up, and was leaning against the wall with his futon neatly folded beside him while Sasuke was just beginning to put away his. Next to them was Menma, who seemed to have made it halfway out of his futon before falling asleep again, snoozing lightly as a trickle of drool dribbled down across his chin. As Naruto walked back across the wooden floor to fold his own futon, he suddenly wondered about the fleeting dream he had had. But even as he thought about it, like a receding tide, the details slipped further and further back from his memory, and after a while, he stopped thinking about it at all. Tajuna's daughter, a willowy woman with a heart-shaped face named Tsunami, prepared breakfast with Sakura while Naruto and the other boys took their turns in the small washroom. Mayu had gone back to Kane's home for the night. Kane's head wound, while not overtly serious, was still affecting her, and they had agreed it would be better for at least one person to always be with her. The breakfast, while predictably involving fish in almost every dish, was delicious, and it was at the breakfast table, 2 separate tables had to be pushed together to make enough room for all of them, that they met Tajuna's grandson Inari, who turned out to be a gloomy young boy in a dull green jumpsuit. "Isn't he cute?" Tajuna said with a fond look down at the boy, who continued to mechanically spoon fish stew into his mouth. Sitting across the table, Naruto silently paralleled him. "He said we're all going to die," said Menma sourly. Sakura nodded in indignant affirmation beside him. "From what you guys were saying about Zabuza, it doesn't sound too far off," said Rai, as he picked at his plate. "He hated fish. How did you guys escape anyways?" Menma pulled back in his chair with a proud look. "We didn't escape. I almost got him, but some hunter-nin finished him off instead." "You almost got him?" "It was all sensei." Sakura scoffed. "And what held Zabuza in place for him?" Menma jabbed a finger at himself, leaving no room for question. "That's right, my mind transfer jutsu." "Oh, is that what it was? I just thought he'd paused to scratch his butt." "Nope, that was me. Butt scratch and all." It was hard for Naruto to imagine anyone looking as proud as Menma did at that moment. "Are they always like this?" Rai asked Sasuke, who grunted noncommittally into his stew. Suddenly, there was a thumping sound as Inari forcibly put down his utensils. The scattered conversations around the table skidded to a stop, and sliding his chair back, Inari dropped to the floor. Tajuna turned around in his chair. "Where are you going, Inari?" "To look at the ocean from my room." Tsunami wiped her hands on her apron. "What about the rest of your breakfast? You skipped dinner yesterday too." "I'm full." Inari slid the door open and left. Menma and Sakura shared guilty glances while everyone else, except Sai, as usual, averted their gazes. "I'm sorry," said Tajuna after a short silence. He took a heavy sip from his cup. He's been like that since Kaiza died. With the mood in the room having rapidly plummeted, the rest of the breakfast was quiet. To most everyone's relief, soon after breakfast had ended, Mayu and Kane arrived. While Kane and her estranged in-laws began to awkwardly exchange greetings, Naruto discreetly pulled Mayu away from the bemused spectator crowd. Sliding the door shut behind them, Naruto turned around to see Mayu looking a bit pale. She was playing with her hair again, as she always did when she was nervous. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said, though her eyes darted to the closed door. "You don't look well. Did something happen?" Naruto critically looked her up and down, but besides the pallor, she seemed fine. "No, I'm fine," Mayu insisted. As if to prove her point, she let go of her hair and crossed her arms across her chest. "What did you want to talk about?" "Mayu, we're going to head back to Konoha today," said Naruto, thinking it'd be best to get straight to the point. Mayu's face fell, but ignoring this, he forged forward. Sakura's team already dealt with the missing nin that attacked, and now that Kane is here with Tajuna and the others, Team Shirakumo can protect her too. "There's no reason for us to be here. Kane-san only agreed to come here because you guys were here," Mayu said quietly. "And they can't always be watching over everyone, they've got their hands full with Tajuna-san's family." "What do you plan to do, then?" "Protect Kane for the rest of her life." Naruto interrupted her. Taking a step closer to her, his voice dropped in volume. "Or are you going to kill Geto?" To her credit, even as her entire face reddened, Mayu did not take a step back, choosing instead to look firmly back at him. "What's the point of escorting someone to their village, only for them to be killed as soon as we leave them? I don't want to just follow the mission details to a T, collect the money, and go back home. I want to do it properly. And I want to do my duty as team leader properly," said Naruto, letting some of the frustration he felt seep into his voice. "You do realize you're putting us all in danger here?" We're always in danger," Mayu said hesitantly. "You're right. But you're asking to risk the lives of our teammates just so you can feel better about yourself," said Naruto harshly, and as soon as the words had left his mouth, he regretted them. Mayu flinched backwards and her gaze dropped to the floor. As the seconds silently ticked by, he rapidly searched through his experiences for words to alleviate the situation, and found nothing. Finally, he added lamely, "It's not like they don't have money. If Kane-san really wanted better bodyguards, she could have paid for a higher-level mission." When Mayu didn't respond, Naruto sighed. That could have gone better, he thought to himself. Not wanting to look at Mayu's bowed head, he looked around the room instead, and almost immediately, his gaze landed on the sliding door. His eyes narrowed. He took a silent step forward, and in one quick motion, slid it open. A streak of black flashed out of sight, leaving behind only one lone blonde figure standing awkwardly by the door. "Hey, he." Menma laughed uncomfortably, his eyes rapidly flicking from Mayu's downcast figure to Naruto's blank face. "I was just, looking for the bathroom. You wouldn't happen to know where it is?" Deciding that confrontation wouldn't be worth the time, Naruto pointed a finger in the opposite direction. As he watched the boy scamper away, Naruto considered the streak of black he'd seen. Obviously, someone else had been with Menma, and he was willing to bet his Tonto that it'd been Rai. But why hadn't he come in and said something? Several seconds passed as Naruto stood still in silent contemplation, and soon, from the other end of the hallway, a pink head popped out. "Naruto?" Sakura sounded suspicious. "What are you doing? Everyone's waiting." "Sorry," he said. Looking back at Mayu, he gestured toward her. "Come on." Mayu mutely bobbed her head and followed him back to the room where everyone else, except Menma, was gathered. Some of the ice seemed to have been broken, though Kane had made a point of sitting on the opposite side of the room from Tajuna. Naruto caught Rai's gaze, but the other boy only flashed him a grin before returning to his apparently all-consuming task of flattening out the creases of his pants. "How are you feeling, Kane-san?" Sakura asked, as everyone settled into their Seiyushians. You look better than you did yesterday, but... Kane slightly bowed her head. It was a slight concussion. I just needed some bed rest. I'm fine now, thank you. Quite the luck she's got there, said Sai, a small smile playing at his lips. Although judging by how they attacked, I don't think the assailants were trying to kill her. No. They were only warning me, Kane said in an odd voice. Her eyes hardened as she looked around at the room's occupants, before coming to a rest on Naruto. Now, getting to the matter of business today, Naruto, have you reached a decision as to your team's next action? Naruto paused, quickly looking at each of his teammates in turn. Sitting nearby, Sai looked neutrally back, farther away. Rai, with an unusually serious look on his face, looked down at the ground, and Mayu, on the opposite end of the room, looked straight at him with a creased brow. Before that, I'd like to hear what Team Shirakumo intends on doing, he said. With that, everyone looked at the Jonin, who was currently resting his splinted leg across two Seiyushians. As Shirakumo opened his mouth to speak, a conflicted expression quickly flitted across his face. 3 days ago, I sent a missive to the Hokage explaining the current situation, and requesting further orders. While I await his reply, we are on standby. Noticing Tajuna's downcast expression, he hastened to add, personally, I feel that it is our duty as ninja to deal with any immediate dangers that risk the safety of our client, however, the ultimate decision is in the hands of our village. That is the best I can offer you. That's already more than enough, Tajuna grunted. What I don't understand is why you need our help, Sasuke suddenly spoke up, surprising Naruto. The Uchiha boy, while not exactly taciturn, had not struck him as the type to take initiative unless the situation absolutely called for it. Kane turned coolly towards him. What do you mean? You clearly have at least some money, as you've been funding the bridge's construction. Why rely on us, instead of properly hiring ninja to deal with the matters here? Or are your pockets not deep enough? Kane opened her mouth, and then closed it. Her hesitation was painfully obvious. However, in gratitude for saving my life, I do owe you all some answers, she said slowly. And even if you cannot help us, I have confidence, or hope, that you will not turn on us. Kane closed her eyes. The Wave Country's daimyo is in Geto's hands. We cannot raise any form of direct rebellion against Geto, and hiring any ninja above Chunin level would be received as such. At her words, Tajuna's face went taut with surprise. What do you mean in Geto's hands? Is he being kept physically captive? Naruto asked, intrigued against his will. From what we know of our last reports, the daimyo and his immediate family are all being kept in house arrest inside their main residence, Kane confirmed. And you can't just assassinate Geto. Rai piped up, looking confused. Oh, we've tried, said Kane bitterly. But the assassination attempt failed, and Geto killed Lady Awa, the daimyo's wife, in retaliation. The daimyo then made a public renunciation, labeling the actions of any who dared to defy Geto as mutiny. Who is this we you're talking about? Sasuke pressed, and then looked meaningfully at Tajuna, who seemed to now be making a passable imitation of a guppy. It can't be the bridge builders. Just a group of the last couple of stragglers with a backbone left in this country, said Kane with a venomous look. Rai scratched his chin. But you haven't tried again since your first failure. Don't you think you gave up too soon? Kane shook her head. You don't understand. Why do you think I was in Konoha? Why do you think I've been traveling around the nations? To sell things. I've been arranging meetings with the Kage of various hidden villages with the aim of making an alliance between theirs and Wave Country. But almost every nation has turned me down, including Fire Country. Really? Sakura looked perplexed. But wouldn't an alliance benefit us? It'd bring more trade into our country. Not necessarily, said Shirakumo gravely, his arms crossed across his chest. Until now, he had remained silent with a neutral expression fixed on his face, but it seemed he had reached some sort of decision. As it stands now, Geto's shipping ventures benefit all of the neighboring countries. There are no tariffs or regulations in place along the coastline, making it an excellent waypoint for maritime trade with farther and wealthier nations such as Water and Tea Country, and Gato is making this possible by taking the money directly out of the citizens' taxes. Yes, Gato knows what he's doing. Kane nodded. He's a parasite, and so long as his actions don't harm the other nations, nobody will lift a finger, because ultimately, Wave Country was never powerful or unified to begin with. If Gato were removed from power, there would be an economic vacuum, the few markets that exist would fall into chaos, and none of the other nations want to risk that. The only nation that would pay attention to my proposals was Lightning Country, and their condition was that they be granted complete control over Wave Country's economy. And what did you say in response? Naruto asked. Kane gave him a thin smile. That I did not have the authority to make such a decision. Despite himself, Naruto felt respect for the sharp-tongued woman virgin inside him. She was clearly doing everything within her power, and beyond, for the sake of a country that she hadn't even been born to. For a moment, he wondered if it was revenge for her brother that pushed her, but immediately dismissed it. If retribution had been her sole aim, Kane would have arranged for Gato's assassination, damn all the consequences. Instead, she was clearly thinking for the benefit of the nation rather than her own gratification, even at the risk of her own life. However, no matter how pretty her goals were, in the end, they weren't his business, nor was he interested in making them his. Tsunami was refilling everyone's teacups, and as he politely declined his cup, Naruto looked directly at Mayu. Surely she would understand. They were ninjas. They weren't heroes. At his pointed stare, Mayu turned pink, and she opened her mouth, when with a loud bang, the door slid open to reveal a blonde figure. Menma. Where've you been? Sakura asked in a scolding tone as she got to her feet. Ignoring her, Menma brandished a sealed scroll in his hand. I've got it, the Hokage's response to Shirakumo-sensei's missive. A messenger Jonin found me at the docks. Immediately, Shirakumo raised his hand, and Menma handed it to him. With bated breaths, everyone watched as he unfurled the scroll. For several minutes, it was quiet. Naruto closely observed Shirakumo's face as his eyes rapidly moved across the scroll paper, but as expected of the Jonin, his expression gave nothing away. When Shirakumo finally spoke, however, the note of disbelief in his voice was clear. My team and any other Leaf teams in the vicinity have been ordered by the Hokage to remain in Wave Country and to do whatever is necessary to guarantee the safety of our clients, he said slowly, and Naruto felt his eyes widen. The uneasy buzzing tension was back, sending alarms ringing in his head. Looking up from the scroll, Shirakumo locked gazes with him. The Hokage's seal is on it. So. Kane said softly. What will your team be doing, Naruto? Look, I've really gotta make my next delivery, said the Takubitsu Jonin, scowling back at Kakashi. While messenger birds were commonly used within the village walls and on occasion by mobilized teams to send messages back to the village, Takubitsu Jonin specializing as messengers were used to deliver important and direct missives from the Hokage to teams stationed in faraway regions. Kakashi had spotted the messenger slipping away from the house that Naruto and the others were currently in, and feeling in his gut that something was off, immediately pounced on him in the neighboring forest. What was that message you delivered? Kakashi pressed, shoving the Jonin more roughly against the tree. I told you, I don't know. I'm just the messenger. The Jonin protested, putting his hands up. Kakashi noticed that he was young, for a messenger Jonin. He didn't recall seeing him around the village either, but that was becoming more and more common these days, as he spent so much time outside the village walls on extended missions. It was from the Hokage. That's funny, said Kakashi, with a look that suggested he found it anything but. I just exchanged messages with him several days ago. You'd think he'd tell me about such a thing. The Jonin shrugged. Kage's minds work differently from ours. Mere ninja like us can't hope to understand them, he said sagely. And anyways, the Hokage's seal was on it. Kakashi paused. Did you receive it directly from the Hokage himself? No, I picked it up in Water Country at the waypoint, said the Jonin, still struggling to free himself. Look, I'm behind in my deliveries as it is and I kinda wanna get back home by the end of this week. Reaching a decision, Kakashi let him go, and the Jonin straightened. Muttering darkly to himself, the Jonin stretched back his shoulders before leaping nimbly away and disappearing from sight. He didn't like this. Why would the Hokage send a separate message to Naruto and the others, while neglecting to tell him? And why send it all the way to Water Country first, instead of sending a direct messenger? Sure, there were many more messengers going between Water and Fire countries, but still, either the Hokage was up to something, or it was extremely unlikely, but even the Hokage's seal could be faked by a powerful Fuinjutsu master. Now, Kakashi found himself with a dilemma. He had to know what that message had said, but at the same time, he couldn't get any closer to the house, or he would be detected. And if it turned out to really be from the Hokage, then he'd have effectively failed his own mission of observing Naruto from afar for nothing. Uncomfortably, Kakashi folded his arms across his chest. He'd give it a day to see what happened. Knowing Naruto, he and the rest of the team would be leaving Wave Country soon and heading back to Konoha. In fact, he was surprised they'd stayed as long as they had. Wanting to avoid running into them on their way back, Kakashi had stayed along the borders of the country until nightfall, and then found, to his surprise, that they had decided to spend the night. However, Naruto was the practical type, and Kakashi fully expected the boy to try and go back to Konoha as soon as possible. But of course now, the Hokage's missive changed things, and Kakashi felt himself growing worried. He wondered if it was just his nerves as team leader, and being unable to actually do anything. Regardless, if Naruto and the others didn't start going back home soon, or if they started acting strangely on the way back, if things came to it, he'd make a new decision then. Kakashi supposed that if he found himself cornered, he could find a way to get Shirakumo alone and have a talk with the other Jonin. But for now, as promised, he would keep watching. It was only after the Inzokamai threatened to have a restraining order placed on him that, with great reluctance, Jiraiya the legendary Sunin, the great Toad Sage, and best-selling author of the hugely popular Icha-Icha series removed himself from its premises. It wasn't that he was afraid of the local police, not by a long shot, but if his dashing mug were to be plastered on posters all around the nation's bathhouses, his research would sadly come to a screeching halt, and then what would he say to his adoring fans? Hitting the road again, Jiraiya tactfully thought to make himself scarce from that area, for a few months, and mulling over his well-worn map, decided to head north to Snow Country. He'd heard that the women there had the most beautiful pearly white skin, and that the hot springs there were medicinal, and indeed, Jiraiya thought that he deserved some time spent healing, with the heartache he now nursed at the thought of his self-imposed banishment from his own country. Instead of heading directly by a land route, which would lead him on a cumbersome path straight through the borders of several nations, Jiraiya decided to board a ship, as a sea route would both be faster, and make for a nice change in pace. In fact, for the next installment of Icha-Icha, he had been thinking of having his main character engage in a whirlwind romance at sea with the beautiful maiden daughter of a ship's captain, which would of course have to end tragically so that he could write a sequel. The journey was cut short however, as it seemed that, despite the thick fog surrounding the land of waves, most ships stopped at its main port city to refuel, as well as to load and unload goods. Hearing from the captain, who, to Jiraiya's great disappointment, had never married nor fathered any daughters, that the ship would be docked for several hours, he went ashore with the intention of stretching his land legs. And for the first time in many years, he found himself speechless with shock. Jiraiya had been walking past a row of disheveled buildings near the port's center, when he saw what looked like a small child crawling on the ground. His lower body was covered by a black rubber tarp, and it was only after Jiraiya gave the boy a second glance that he realized that the boy didn't have any legs. The child's face was bony and drawn, and the only signs of life were his hands, which relentlessly slapped down on the ground before him and pushed his body up just a few inches at a time. "Where are you going, child?" Jiraiya asked softly, kneeling beside him. However, the boy didn't seem to hear him. Instead, silently, he kept pushing himself forward. "If he makes it to the other side of the city by tonight, he'll get fed," said a young girl, who'd been poking lethargically at the ground with a stick. Jiraiya paused. "Fed? By who?" "People who think it's funny," said the girl with a shrug. Something hard clenched in Jiraiya's stomach, and he got up. He looked around, and as if seeing for the first time, finally noticed the hard gazes of the passing people and the listless children gathered at every corner. Jiraiya had heard the rumors, of course, about how a man named Gato had managed to get his claws on a small island nation and sucked the very life out of its people. At the time, he'd merely thought that it wasn't any of his business and had passed it over. But hearing was not the same as seeing, and the mild discomfort he had felt then now turned into full-blown sorrow. It had been a long time since he had seen people brought down to such low levels. It had been bad in Konoha for a while following the Nine Tails attack, but nowhere near what he saw here. No, the last time Jiraiya had seen such a bleak setting had been during the Second Shinobi World War, when orphans on war-torn battlefields had been like particles of sand on a beach. When he returned to the dock, his mind was a storm of roiling thoughts, but one made itself the clear winner. "We're leaving in 10 minutes, you'd better return to your cabin," said the captain, leaning over the railing of the ship. Jiraiya rummaged in his pocket, and finding a coin, he flipped it up to the man, who caught it with an adept grab. "I'll be staying here for just a bit longer," he called up to him. "You can keep the change." Waving his hand, letting the captain's farewell wash over him, "Hold on, hey, come back here. This isn't the full fare." Jiraiya began to head for the nearest bar, where he would hopefully be able to pry from the loose lips of a drunken sailor the full story of the country's current sorry state of affairs. The sun was low in the sky when they reached the dock. The fog for once was gone, leaving behind a gradient of purple to orange that then dissolved into murky water. There were only 2 boats there. One was a battered-looking fishing boat that had likely seen much better days. The other was a cargo ship, with black steam belching obnoxiously from a smokestack. It was on this ship that they'd be getting on. Before boarding, Naruto and the others exchanged farewells with their benefactor. "I appreciated your escorting me here," Kane said with a gracious smile, dabbing at something in her eyes with her sleeve. "I'll never forget you all, and I hope you won't forget me, either." "Oh, we will," Sai promised pleasantly. Mayu smiled tremulously. "Goodbye, Kane-san." "You have to be brave, Mayu," said Rai, putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know." "Well, let's get going then," said Naruto a tad impatiently. With a final wave, Naruto and the others boarded the ship, which they found themselves fortunate to have caught. It would have been tough to find one leaving Wave Country on such short notice, but with Kane backing them, money had exchanged hands and the ship's captain had agreed to make a short detour back to Fire Country. "You kids are ninja." The captain, a gruff-looking man with a thick black mustache, eyed their Hitaiate suspiciously. "Awfully young, aren't you?" "Actually, our growth's got stunted by our training. We're probably around your age, assuming you're 60 or so." The captain couldn't have been a day over 50, but with his usual placid smile, Sai displayed his remarkable aptitude for lying through his teeth. Naruto privately thought to himself that the boy could probably do quite well for himself in the Chunin betting games. "We appreciate you going out of your way to take us back to our country," said Mayu earnestly. Leaning over the side of his ship, the captain spat out a wad of something black and slimy into the ocean, giving Naruto an unwelcome inkling of what the murk in the water could be. "Before that though, we'll be making a pit stop at a port town farther up north." "That'll be just fine," said Naruto. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we'll be resting in our cabin. We're tired and we have our own food, so unless the ship catches on fire or something, you don't have to bother with us," Rai added helpfully. "Your own food, eh?" "Well, I'm not complaining," said the captain. Then with a grunt of dismissal, he turned around to shout something at a passing crew member. Naruto and the rest of his team slipped into their cabin, where for about an hour, they rested on rotting bunk beds that creaked with every slosh of a wave against the ship's hull. When they felt the ship still and footsteps increased in volume around them, they each removed their Hitaiate and pulled on a nondescript cloak. Making sure that their faces were hidden below the hoods, they crept out onto the boat's deck one by one, being careful to mingle with the small crowd of people who were getting off the ship. It had grown dark and damp, and their cloaked figures did not stand out from the others, who were similarly dressed. Just as Naruto stepped foot on the gangplank, however. "Hey, you lot!" A crew member hollered down at them, and they froze, wondering if they'd been caught. "Yes?" Mayu asked, shuffling around. The man, or rather, boy, looked down at them imperiously through beady eyes, and in that split second, Naruto began to reach for the kunai strapped to his thigh. But then, the boy's expression caved in, and leaning forward, he lowered his voice. It's my turn to peel the potatoes so I can't go on land, but get me something I can chew on for a bit. I'm feeling queasy. Here, I'll even give you a coin for it. He flipped something toward them that glinted under the dim dock lights as it spun, and with a practiced hand, Rai grabbed it smoothly out of the air. Of course, Rai answered, looking down at the coin, and then back up at the boy with a predator-like smile. I owe you, said the boy gratefully with a queasy smile. However, as soon as the boy had disappeared from sight, Rai pocketed the coin with a whistle. Rai. Mayu hissed. What? Rai said defensively. He had to learn his lesson sooner or later. As they exchanged small talk, the four casually separated from the rest of the group, and once Mayu had indicated that the coast was clear, they slipped down the wall to the river that spanned the town. The darkness of the night and the shadows of the overhanging bridges and walls hid them. Directing their chakra to their feet, they began to run across the water's surface as silently as they could. Only when they had left behind the last building of the port city, did Naruto allow himself to even slightly relax. Think that was good enough? Rai muttered. Naruto glanced around, straining to extend his senses as far as he could. They were now in marshland, and with the moon almost completely blocked out by clouds that evening, even their trained eyes found it hard to make out anything in the horizon. The most obvious presences are gone now, but to be sure, I'll keep the clones around for as long as I can, he said quietly. It had been Kane's idea. While they hadn't exactly announced themselves to Wave Country, Naruto and his team hadn't bothered to hide their presence or their identities. That was the point of their Hitayate after all, to identify them as ninja of their villages. Anyone who dared to trifle with someone wearing the leaf Hitayate would be responded to in kind by the full might of Konoha, and Konoha was one of the most powerful hidden villages. However, Kane had suggested that Naruto and his team should pretend to leave Wave Country, so that her and Tajuna's enemies would relax their guard and underestimate them. Shirakumo had liked the plan, agreeing that 8 leaf nin gathered in one place was too obvious of a confrontation and would likely provoke unwanted attention. Giving Shirakumo his due respect as the most senior ninja in the vicinity, Naruto had bowed to his suggestion. His shadow clones, disguised as each member of his team, were still in the ship's cabin while he and his real team were to return under cover of darkness to Tajuna's town. They would have to lie low for a while of course, but the gnawing sense that he was being constantly watched had disappeared, and Naruto suspected their plan had went off without a hitch. As Naruto continued to run in the deep darkness, his thoughts turned to the clones he'd left behind on the ship. He'd told the others, mostly for size's sake, that he would dismiss them as soon as the ship reached Fire Country, but it'd been partially a lie. Everything about the Hokage's missive had seemed fishy to him, and it hadn't been the fish stew. Why had the messenger given the message to Menma, instead of Shirakumo, for whom it had been intended? Normally, messengers were under strict orders to deliver their message to a specific recipient, and depending on the importance of the message, had to go through several stringent procedures to verify the recipient's identity. And even if the message really had been from the Hokage, why were they being told to stay in Wave Country, effectively interfering with the affairs of another nation? At least another dozen questions raged inside his mind, but Naruto suppressed them. One of his clones had left the ship with them at the pit stop, and would make his way back to Konoha. Once there, he'd be able to get a direct explanation from the Hokage about what was going on. Until then, he would obey the Hokage's mandate. And while he didn't like it, he would go along with Kane's fantasies of freedom and Mayu's illusions of playing hero. At the moment, Naruto couldn't see his teammates, but he could sense them running beside him, and he felt something hard clench in his stomach. It was dangerous out here in Wave Country, and he'd do whatever it took to protect his team. Whatever it took. But suddenly, his eyes widened and Naruto came to a screeching stop, as with zero warning, almost as if slamming headfirst into an invisible wall, he felt a horrifyingly familiar aura of cold bloodlust surge up out of seemingly nowhere. A cry of alarm rising belatedly to his lips, he immediately fell into a defensive stance. Hearing Rai swear beside him, he felt the others do the same. Well, what do we have here? A gloating man's voice rung out from the darkness several meters in front of them. New heathens to offer up for divine judgment, that's what. Shut up and do your job, newbie. Stop calling me a newbie. That's it for part 4. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.